passed an it was his understanding that they had passed that resolution. There are several different versions of the Presbyterian Church. We are the Presbyterian Church USA. There is another Presbyterian church group called Presbyterian Church of America, PCA. And they have added a US to the end of their name, all in lowercase. And when you Google PC in parentheses USA, the first three documents you get are from the PCA Church. The PCA Church is a very conservative version of Presbyterianism. In the 2016, their General Assembly, they did pass a document against the doctrine of discovery. The PC parentheses USA, our version of Presbyterian, which is sort of known as the more liberal version because we allow GLBT folks to take leadership positions. They also had an overture that came to them about the doctrine of discovery. And they did the wonderful thing that our version of Presbyterianism loves to do, and they referred it to the Committee on Racism. They did not vote on it in that 2016 GA. They referred it to the Committee on Racism and instructed the Committee on Racism through all of the various agencies of the Presbyterian Church USA and all of the like the Synod and the Presbytery to develop curriculum to address the whole issue of racism, including how the doctrine of discovery is a part of all of that. And then to encourage churches to study the curriculum. Well, you can see that we are not 2017, we are 2026, and we are looking at this particular doctrine. So the churches are always behind the time on that, but it is coming up again at this General Assembly that is happening right now. And we are following it to see what they do with it, and we will let you know.
Thank you. Dr. Puglisi, we'll let you introduce yourself. We're glad to have you from Milwaukee. Thank you for being here. Well, I think what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to have Jim talk to us. We probably would do better if we wait and have questions and answers after. That would allow the Zoom to catch up better. So Jim, if you do your thing and stop when you're ready, and then we can do some Q&A if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome from Milwaukee. Although I lived in Austin for about 16 years, I worked at St. Edward's University in campus ministry, doing worldview and religious diversity support. So I'm quite familiar with Austin. Spent a quarter of my life there, which is kind of hard to believe, but been in Milwaukee now for about 3 years. But I'm from Pittsburgh. I always make that very clear. I'm from Pittsburgh. That's home. Yeah, my address was Milwaukee and Austin. So yeah, I got invited to join you all through one of my former colleague, Sky, who I did some work with in Austin. When I was in Austin, I did a lot of work with the Marist Task Force and Austin's Community College and their Truth Racial Healing Transformation Center was on committee to help get that started. Did a lot of the courageous conversation stuff. So yeah, Austin is a second home for me. So just good to be with you. They did not include flight, otherwise I would have been with you in person. Maybe next time.
Yes.
Uh, So I'm going to throw a lot of things at you at first. The more I got into this, the more it wanted to spin me out in so many different directions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a smattering. This might, if you're familiar with the movie, um, the Chevy Chase movie, the vacation movie, they stop at the Grand Canyon for about 3 seconds and they move on, that because that's all the time they had, and that's what this might feel like a little bit. But hopefully, at the end of it, it will raise some questions for you to start doing your own digging, because that is really what needs to happen is for each person to do their own homework, do their own digging, do their own work. Uh, and if you have a question along the way, if you can hold it, please do. But if not, if it needs or you need clarity on something, please let me know. If you're on Zoom, you can hit the little hand function and I'll try to spot that and get to your question. And then I think we may have a little bit more fun with Q&A, where I can make things up. So, um, but yeah, so I do apologize that this may seem like I'm going a lot of different places, but there's just so many ways you could go at this to address this subject area. So with that, let's. So I'm just, I'm not going to read the entire acknowledgement, but just this is the Presbyterian of Milwaukee's land acknowledgement. We're in the home of the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee and the Potawatomi. And actually, my friend Sky in Austin is of the Potawatomi people. Um, but I think it's important, to know where we're at, whose land that are on, and the long history of Christianity has both in celebration and trauma for people of color and everything in between. Um, so it's Wisconsin's a very has a very large indigenous population, and lots of even some areas. The Oneida just had some land transferred back over to them from their local township. There's several instances of
Wow.
that, but there's also a large history of boarding schools and those type of things. So it's an interesting part of the country to look at the history of indigenous peoples in this particular part of the country. So with that, who's this?
I mean, yeah.
Who is this?
Jesus.
Which one?
One back behind you.
The one back behind me. Why that one?
Because you,
Say that. Sorry, you cut out for a second.
sorry, he looks Jewish.
He looks Jewish. Okay. All right. Okay. Uh,
Black.
any others?
Top right.
Top right.
Yeah.
That's probably the one most of us are used to seeing. Of course, we know better to know that none of these are a picture of Jesus because one, they didn't have cameras. You know, nobody was
Yeah.
around and no one was following him saying, this guy's going to be big one of these days, so I'm going to take his picture. They weren't doing selfies and things like that with Jesus. But we have been acculturated to view Jesus in a certain way. And that reflects, our Eurocentric ways of viewing Jesus in much of our country. So I just try to start off with this, just to kind of see how we're impacted. So let's see how we. So in the year 2000, the National Catholic Reporter actually commissioned an art contest to do a new portrait of Jesus, and this is the one that actually won. And you can see a lot of different features, uh, both to indigenous culture, but even from gender. There's a fluidity in the gender possibility. Really, it could be. male, it could be female, it could be non-binary. You don't really know. Um, so I liked this one because it really kind of was one of the first things I saw to thrust me out of that Eurocentric view of what Jesus looked like. So so when we talk about privilege, part of I'm a white male, white cisgender male of white Catholic privilege, I say. Um, and oops. I have a new laptop, so I'm gonna probably do that a couple of times. So when we talk about a hegemony of privilege, privilege will narrowly define how culture looks. It will favor the dominant group, and will tend to proselytize the dominant group's realities or social realities or vision. Uh, we define what is normal, what is normative. Okay. And oftentimes that becomes, a universal concept of how to view things, but that more often just reflects the group that is in power's position. Um, and oftentimes that conception is even supported by those who are being marginalized by the same thing, depending on, each person's history, how they came to impact privilege. Some problematic concepts for Christianity is we have this long, heavy emphasis on good and evil, kind of this binary way of viewing the world, this or that, nothing in between. Um, we see where that becomes an issue when we look at, gender fluidity, how we look at good and evil. Black and white colors, color schemes. When the Christian missionaries went to Africa, the Catholic missionaries would show up at funerals dressed in black and show up at baptisms in white, except in Africa, the colors were reversed. Black was the color of life and white was the color of death. You can see how that would be a visual problem at the beginning. You know, we take what is normal for us into other places. Um, our concept of love in Christianity can tend to be very hierarchical. God the Father, Christ the Son, God our Father. You know, we are children of God. And it could also be very, gender paternalistic. And then we have the whole idea that, individuals are sinner, and that's kind of our core reality for much of Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity, where the whole concept of sin and the individual, and that we have to be saved. And I grew up I grew up in the Catholic and the evangelical setting. I was I'm Catholic by birth. Spent a long time in the Christian Missionary Alliance Church in the evangelical world, and then came back to my Catholicism. I always said I'm too Sicilian to be Protestant, because my culture just kind of gets in the way. Um, so that kind of idea of individuals are sinners. We also have had a tabula rasa approach of things, very Eurocentric Christian approach to others. Uh, the missionary, uh, in the beginning, Catholic missionaries, but I would say, Protestant missionaries as well, kind of went in with the idea that people were a blank slate, that if you didn't believe in Christianity, you didn't believe in anything at all. Um, and there was one of my favorite speakers, Edwina Gately, a Catholic. She started off with the English Missionary Society, and she was preparing to go to Africa and be a missionary. And when she got there, she said she was pleasantly surprised that God had beaten her there. Um, so we have this idea that, people are a blank slate. So, um, as I said, kind of this idea that if you don't believe in what I believe, you don't believe in anything. And, I find that even a problem in the interfaith movement. I was involved a lot with IACT, Interfaith Action of Central Texas. And I love that group, and work for them. But even in the interfaith movement, I don't use the word interfaith anymore. I use worldview and religious diversity because if you are a secular humanist or an atheist, you still have a value system. You still love your children. You still love your, spouses. We all operate from a value system. There just may not be a deity involved. So we all have a belief system of some form. So I know you've been talking a lot about the doctrine, or I was told that you were talked a little bit about the doctrine of discovery, and so I hope some of this isn't redundant. But I'm going to view a lot of this probably more through a Catholic lens, because that's my tradition, and we're the ones that really got it rolling anyway. So um, when we talk about the doctrine of discovery, we're going back to that, we call it the age of discovery, which is, you can chew on that a lot too. People like, I wasn't discovered, I was already here type of, if you're part of the indigenous communities. But it was developed through a series of papal bulls. And, this really started when European um, explorers started encountering other cultures, first in Africa and then, the Indian subculture, subcontinent. And they were kind of fleshing out how do we view the people there? Um, and are they Christians? Are they heathens? Are they, pagans? They had all these terminologies. It was really a question of human anthropology, of how did the church view the human person, um, and also laws of possession, land and possession. So through a couple papal bulls, Dum Diversas, Roman Pontificus, these set up the idea that where there was no declared ownership, the church could take over. Of course, it was never like there was a strong investigation into actually who owned something, but it was more about if you did not believe in, if you were not Christian, you did not have the capacity to have intellectual reason. Kind of this view, this very um, paternalistic view of the human person, and in some cases, not even viewing them as human. Um, and all moving up to Columbus, with the moving into what would be called the Americas, even though that's not a Western Hemisphere, word. Um, and it set up where wherever Spain would go, they could claim territory if it was not already claimed by another country. Some of this was a battle between Portugal and Spain, and who could be the main slave trader in the New World, who could be the new economic lead. And the 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 doctrine of discovery set up this division of South America, what we would call South America, between Portugal and Spain. And you'll see a line and on the map here to the far the let's see it's the second one in from the right, and basically they set up that anything west of that line would be Spanish territory and anything east of that line would be Portuguese territory. And Portugal could still maintain the slave trade. Spain could not. And part of that was what was going on with European politics, and trying to the papacy trying to placate two Catholic countries that did not have a good relationship with each other, and Portugal being very dependent upon the slave trade. So economics and power are always in play when we're talking about privilege and such. So, which is one of the reasons why also Brazil speaks Portuguese and the rest of South America speaks Spanish, because of this. So just, really kind of setting up this idea of wherever wherever we are discovering new lands, if it's not already declared property of somebody, then and there's no Christianity there, then it could be taken over. And the prime thing was there Christianity or not? So there's a lot of dates on that. So when we think about Columbus and we think about discovery, and I'm Italian, like the idea of Columbus being our Columbus was Columbus Day came about because the Italian American community, which was not necessarily treated greatly when it came over, was looking for a way to assert itself in the United States culture and be accepted. And so they pushed Columbus. I would have rather had Mother Cabrini, who helped immigrants be a better example. Also, Columbus actually never set foot on any part of what is now the United States. So that's what cracks me up. But anyways. Columbus took possession. Okay. If you would see the pictures, and I should have included some of these, you'll see the visual, the art of the day is Columbus placing a flag, a papal flag, a Spanish flag, and when we place a flag, we claim possession, claim ownership of it. Also in those portraits, the indigenous are seen as very scared, very frightened. It's you can just see the power dynamic. I apologize for not including a picture of that. I should have. But as you think
We
about,
looked at that picture
par-
last week.
pardon me,
We
you
looked
looked
at
at that
that
last
picture
week?
first.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, good. So you kind of not you have know what I'm talking about. But this placing of flags is very important. I cannot wait to see what happens once another country gets to the moon and places another flag there. And then because right now we kind of think we own it. I think that's kind of our U.S. mindset. That's a side thing. Um, but we have this idea of naming and claiming in history that we changed the names San Salvador, Santa Maria de Concepcion, all these we did not adopt indigenous names of land features or towns or anything. When the Spanish came, they replaced. And there's a sense of claiming when we do that. Even the word Indian, indigenous. So there's part of privilege is genocide, cultural genocide, as well as genocide of people. Uh, and it's an imposed subordination, particularly in Spain, the Spanish conquest. There was no mediation. There were established countries, there were established kingdoms that could have been mediated with, but being owned was part of discovery. Again, that tabula rasa idea.
Hmm.
Um, there was a debate. I'm going to talk about it in a second. Between, when we talk about paganism was a term, it kind of denoted uh, where there was a lack of presence of Christianity, people in those areas, or oftentimes in the rural areas, even in Europe, oftentimes were viewed as pagans because they were beyond the Christian structure. Um, and then heathens, barbarians were, if there was any sense of ritual sacrifice and stuff like that, that's where a lot of times the term heathen and barbarians came into it. And that word barbarian was used, for the Celts, for the French, for the Irish, as Rome moved up into Europe, they were conquering the barbarians. Um, One of the things we forget, I think, in European understanding is there were indigenous populations in Europe if you go back far enough in European history. Uh, and that's not to be an excuse, but that should be a point of understanding. How do we look into, our own European, how colonization even moved across Europe, like in the Roman time, as a point of empathy and a point of trying to understand. You're seeing a lot going on in Ireland last week in Belfast, because you have a rise of white nationalism happening in that part of the world.
Hmm.
So when I think of in college, I did my senior thesis on how Catholicism was introduced into the New World, and it kind of had it came up from Spain and it came over from Europe, from England and France. And those two kind of met up, at some point. But English colonization was rooted in the Reformation, very anti-Catholic, this idea of city on the hill, something that Reagan picked up later. That came from Winthrop, looking at scriptures like Micah 6, believe it or not. Um, the English came to settle, the Spanish came to plunder, to be honest. The Spanish did not come to
Yeah.
settle. Um, they only ended up settling because the soldiers had nowhere to go back to. Uh, so, and evangelism was really the purpose of the English, and less so the French, but more so the English. Again, this idea of good and evil. Um, so back to the human anthropology, the Spanish, when they first viewed the indigenous population, they viewed them as being pagans, having no soul. So if they have no soul, then they could be uh, put into slavery. So indigenous were enslaved at first, but there were Catholic priests that also traveled with the sword in the Bible always kind of traveled together with the Spanish, and there were several Catholic priests that had a different view, developed a different view of the indigenous people, that they could have souls, that they had souls. And if they have souls, then they couldn't be enslaved. That would be against Christianity to enslave someone who had a soul, who could be converted. Um, and that actually led to this Valladolid debate about, whether indigenous people had a soul or not. And it became a very uh, it was really did they have the capacity of rational thought? Could they understand basics of Christianity? Um, but it was still in a very paternalistic mindset. Even De la Casa, who was the one who advocated for the indigenous, still had the intent of converting them to Catholicism. But he believed that they could be converted, whereas many believe they just couldn't be converted. They didn't have the capacity. So that was the early debate about whether they had souls or not. Once that was determined that they had souls, then they could not be enslaved. Unfortunately, that also kind of opened the door for the African slave trade because they needed labor and they needed to look elsewhere for labor. So they went to the African continent, and that was one of the things that helped contribute to the African slave trade was this change of view on the indigenous population. Now, it doesn't mean the indigenous population all of a sudden had a windfall by any means, but there was a change in their status. I put the Spanish intermarriage because I was actually presenting to a group of Austin educators about the Spanish, um, and I was talking about how the Spanish intermarried, and I got called on the carpet that what we view, particularly in the Catholic Church, is something we have to deal with in our history, was really rape and assault. You know, and how do we view, kind of that, and I think you see that with indigenous populations wherever that, you know, uh, what we Catholics thought it was kind of our ritual, uh, converting people to Catholicism often was more along the lines of assault. Um, as I said, if you go to California, if you go to any of the missions in Texas, there's usually a presidio nearby. Um, the army and the church always kind of travel together. Um, the English, their kind of view was convert, assimilate, or be pushed out. They did not really want to mix cultures. The Spanish did a little bit more mixing culture. The English did not. Um, indigenous populations. Um, After the Revolutionary War, a lot of the indigenous population, particularly in like Ohio and Kentucky, Tennessee, anything west of the Alleghenies, those tribes tended to align with the British because the British told them that their land would not be settled. The British had drawn a line at the Allegheny Mountains prior to the Revolutionary War that um, colonists could not move into the land west of the Alleghenies. That was one of the reasons why for the revolution to start, because colonists wanted to expand west, and the British said no. So the indigenous aligned with the British, and then after the British lost the revolution, they paid a price for that over the next 40, 60, 80 years for having aligned with the British for many of those tribal groups. Um, Africans who were abducted, probably a third of them were Muslim. Significance of that, they were religious people. They had a faith. They had a faith in a in the monotheistic God that we share. Um, the Hebrew scriptures were used to justify and to combat slavery. The idea of oppression, submit to your master, liberation, the Exodus story. Um, and then we get to that question of were Africans human or not. That was a debate that would, flow into the United States and our development of chattel slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise. I mean, if you're three-fifths of a person, that kind of pretty much says you're not a human being in my mind. So, yeah. Did you see this picture when you talked about Doctrine of Discovery?
No,
This
no,
is
not yet.
a portrait on Manifest Destiny. Um, and it's a fascinating one if you look at it. There's just a lot of different messages that you could see being and this was painted in the 1800s with John Sullivan. Um, and I'm trying to be aware of time. But you can just see the imagery, like the movement from the east of trains and telegraph and the chasing of indigenous to the left of the photo, the kind of this manifest destiny, this movement west, and that sense of entitlement. I particularly love the woman. What's it look like she's carrying?
A sign.
Yeah, I think it's when I first saw it, I just kind of jumped that she's carrying a Bible. It's not a Bible, but uh, you have this kind of the early trappings of a civil religion developing in the United States, which is something that I feel we have here is today we have a clash between what is
We're back.
Christianity and what is a civil religion. So I'm going to
Yeah.
keep us moving here. Um, in the westward expansion, we've jumped ahead in years. Uh, Slavery was essential to the economy. Many felt it was ordained by God. We have the initiation of boarding schools starting to pop up run by the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Catholic Church, and others. And these were meant to, since Christianize the heathen. And as I said, uh, uh, the idea is to eradicate all culture and practices from the children on the reservations. When we get to the Civil War, the North used scripture is used as judgment for the nation, for the Confederacy, for the practice of slavery, and the South used scripture as evil seeking to destroy their prescribed way of life. Again, and you have just to look at the breakup of the Christian church due to the revolution and the denominational splits and stuff is a fascinating and tragic um, um, view of history. And yeah, so when we look at the two beside each other, Doctrine of Discovery, first discoveries really you might view it as actual occupancy. Um, Preemptive European title, trumping any indigenous title, terra nullius, meaning basically possessions nine-tenths of the law type of thing, and Christianity denotes civilization. Manifest Destiny takes that to a very U.S. kind of focus. The special virtues of American exceptionalism that we hear a lot about. This idea of being a light on the hill, of being to make our world into the image of God. Um, our Puritans, I mean, from day one, we've had religious diversity in this country. I kind of grew up thinking Puritans and Pilgrims were the same, and they weren't. The Puritans were very radical, very extreme. The Puritans were a little bit more, I wouldn't say moderate. They both wanted to create a model society. Um, but the Puritans did it, they wanted to change structures and basically create a Christian, you know, uh, kingdom, Christian, not kingdom, but a Christian colony. The Pilgrims are a little bit more on just wanting the freedom to be able to have their religious beliefs, their religious communities, because they were breaking away from the Anglican Church. They had actually tried to stay within Anglicanism at first, and now we're just seeking religious freedom. So even the Puritans and the Pilgrims are not the same people. So our diversity starts from the very beginning of our country. Um, so with that, let's see. I don't think I have too much more because, again, I could go on all day with this stuff. The Gilded
Yeah.
Age brought black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, the Lost Cause. This is something I've found interesting. If you look at old Western movies, you will hear the Lost Cause come up quite a bit if you really pay attention to it. Usually Confederates or former Confederates are always treated much better than former Union. When you talk about in Western movies, I grew up with a bad impression of the North as being carpetbaggers into the South, and I'm from Pittsburgh. Um, just that, and that all that was very intentional. Part of that coming from the Daughters of Confederacy, the building of monuments, which all happened monuments tend to pop up when there have been periods where the Black community has found agency and have been able to start organizing, and it creates a pushback. And so none of these monuments were erected right after the war. Most of them were erected like after World War One, when Black troops came home from the war, having been trained and organized, and all of a sudden wanted to push back on culture because they had the ability to do so. Then you have the rise of, you know, these monuments and other ways that we push back. You have the whole period of Jim and Jane Crow. The church was very much involved in that. You have the rise of fundamentalism, increasing divide between intellectualism with morality, temperance movement, eugenics movement. If you're not familiar with the eugenics movement in the late 1800s and 1900s, that was the whole movement to categorize blacks, Caucasian. It's where you get terms like Mongoloid, Caucasian, um, um, Negroid, where they were looking at skull sizes and trying to determine what race you belong to based on the shape and size of your skull. Okay, and there was a whole classification system. This was very prominent in Ivy League schools, Princeton particularly, impact on medicine, and you can just imagine it had a lot of good standing, not good standing, but it had a lot of viewed credibility at its time, and we still hear it come up, um, you know, so. Dawes Act is, if you're not familiar with the Dawes Act, that was where um, it was basically trying to integrate indigenous into American culture. So this is where really had the boarding schools, but this split up tribal lands from being communal lands to individual uh, parcels. So really taking the indigenous community away from their historic culture, their historic way of being together. Um, I mention this because this is an act of power. So we have both the individual impact upon people, but we also have the systemic um, power structures that try to marginalize people of color, indigenous populations, and such. I'm trying to be mindful that you're in the Southwest and you're not in Milwaukee like I am, but and it has its own unique history. Uh, so I'm gonna let me skip ahead, and I just want to see what else I had coming up, and this might be a time for just go to. Are you ready for questions? Would you like to do some questions, or I could keep spewing for a little bit more?
Let's try some questions, Jim, see where that goes.
Okay, that's fine, and we can always come back, or yeah, if we need to.
Thank you. Let's start. Any questions? Raise your hand so we can see you.
I'm going to stop
Anybody
sharing
online?
too.
Joe?
Yeah, the in Manifest Destiny painting, did you ever determine what was in the angel or the woman's hand?
I think it was a legal book, if I remember correctly. It was like a it wasn't the Constitution, but it was like I think it had the scales of justice on it, if I remember correctly. Um, but I might be making that up. I do remember that it was related to a legal structure. It was not a religious book. It wasn't a Bible. So it was more about this idea of United States and our Constitution, which was viewed by many as being a religious doctrine, as we still have that today. We still have that conflict going on.
Other comments, other questions?
Tony,
Tony, thank you, Paul. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Um, I was just wondering what you might think of something I've been noticing a lot lately is how, and I should say I used to teach U.S. history and studied, my sort of focus was on race and racism and the
Mm.
history of that and a focus on Chicano history, Chicano history.
So you know a
And
lot more than I do. I apologize for anything I've said.
oh, no, it's very interesting. But I sort of have a sense, you were talking about sort of English colonization and the earlier Spanish colonization and sort of the differences,
Mm.
one culture more interested in separation, segregation, comes out of one, and then, more assimilation, though problematic and all that sort of thing. But I've noticed, when people within the U.S., and I remember reading a book, sort of a book about this too in graduate school, what's it called? My Own Misfortune and None of Your Own, something like that was a
Mm.
title. But I notice because of the sort of frame of white supremacy that is sort of the crucible of the US, that oftentimes when the people from the dominant culture talk about native cultures, they still sort of do it from this frame of racial purity and white supremacy and romanticization. Whereas it sort of kind of misses some of what you've pointed out, that difference of how the different sort of strands of these histories interact with each other and sort of overlap. Some of it, I think, having to do with, like you're talking about, the anti-Catholicism and all of that.
Mhm.
But I'm just, notice that sometimes people, perhaps unintentionally, end up replicating because of that lens of white supremacy that is the U.S. When they talk about native cultures, they heavily romanticize and that racial purity thing comes into play in a very pronounced way and discussions about it. I don't know if that's something you've keyed in on or have considered.
I don't know if I keyed in it, but yeah, I think that's still from. I know I struggle with that even in kind of religious diversity of like when I look at another culture, I'm wanting to understand them, and I'm oftentimes very hesitant to point out. I think human beings are human beings, and every culture has a capacity for some great good and some great bad. And I think sometimes there is a tendency to overcompensate, and particularly, in the case of indigenous people, there is that romanticizing of the culture, and n- I think the only way you can get around that is to really be in engagement, be in relationship with people of other cultures so that everyone can get their stuff out on the table, and really move forward together as, you know, I- you're a Presbyterian church. I believe we're all created in the image of God, everyone, whether I like it or not, type of thing,
yeah.
uh, so, how do we do that in light of our different cultural expressions and stuff. And I don't believe, I think one of the issues with white culture is we don't know what that means. I don't know, my grandparents are immigrants from Sicily, so I cling to that. But I know more about that from the Godfather films than I do about anything that was passed along, so what is white identity. And even in deconstructing it, which we need to, we have to, but I also worry about what fills in them. And I think
Yeah,
that gulf is where it makes it easy pickings for nationalism and groups that are it's kind of like gang recruiting or group recruiting. It's you're grabbing people that have a void and don't know how to fill it. And I think that's my I'm speculating there. That's just my thoughts on that. But so I don't know if that got to what you're talking about or not.
One other little pitch I'll make this morning. I happen to be I'm living in Spain now. I'm of Mexican descent, so it's
Hmm.
been a little traumatic, over the
Hmm.
years, my relationship with Spain as it's developed.
Hmm.
Knowing the history, having taught the history and felt it,
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
bones. But I was watching this morning because I have some friends who are from Morocco. So I was like, oh, I think I'd like to watch a history of Morocco, so I can see the world from that particular perspective, like from the other side of, of the water,
Yeah.
towards Spain rather than, sort of out. And one of the interesting sort of sections that came up was they were talking about how there was actually which sort of surprised me, because I've also studied some of the history of slavery, is how there were folks down here in this Andalusia region who had like, pirates that had kidnapped a lot of these white Europeans, like 30,000 white Europeans got kidnapped and put into slavery in North Africa, and there was just all this sort of interesting kind of back and forth of people taking slaves in one direction and stealing slaves in the other, and there was
Hmm.
kind of an interesting extra complexity. So just I'll put a link to that documentary in the chat
Yeah.
for other folks. But I think it's just also important to remember to like with history, it's fascinating because you can always go a little further back. Like your history is interesting, but it's also from an American perspective. If you look at how the Spanish came to be who they are and their whole background, then suddenly the lens opens up and you have a lot more to see and consider. So that's all.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the US, we tend to try to view history as this one linear line of history. And I'm looking
yeah.
at 20 some people on the screen, which means there's 20 histories going on right now, all at the same time. Um, and, as I think about the Spanish, part of what they carried over into their incursion into the Western Hemisphere was a continuation of the Reconquista of
Yeah.
taking over Spain for Christianity and driving the Muslims and the Jewish out. And thank God for the Muslim community because they were the ones who preserved the Jewish community, you know, and they carried that kind of conquest over to here. And then, I mean, you look at Mexico, which has, Hispanic, mestizo, like the layers of race that are within. And I mean, Mexico, I think only in the last 10 years, even created a category for Black Mexicans, recognizing them as part of part of the fabric. And that impacts, Texas, our southwestern states that were formerly, where the people didn't move, the line moved. And then you have like things like immigration, like I think like in places like San Antonio. But this, with every culture, you have first, second, third generation immigration. Oftentimes, first generation aren't always receptive for second and third generation immigration. I saw this in the Italian community where the first generation made it, and now all of a sudden refugees and poor are coming in from, and like making us look bad type of thing. That mindset. The Italians did this, every cult, it's that,
Yeah, you
um,
end up internalizing some of
mm,
the dominant society and
yeah,
then replicating. Yeah.
yeah. And that plays out, so yeah, I can go off on
Well,
that.
thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Meredith had,
Mir
Meredith has her hand up.
Muted.
Meredith?
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question because part of the conflict between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples was over who had being and who did not.
Mhm.
Land, by indigenous definitions, was a being. So was water. So were uh, trees and plants.
Mhm.
How far back in European history do we have to go defined where we once saw those things as beings, because it seems so. How can we bridge that divide as we try to overcome racism and things like that when we are still in speciesism?
Yeah. I mean, I think you'd have to look at each part of Europe, or or pre-Christian Europe. Uh, I will say, like, what comes to mind for me, it's not quite what you're talking about, but the Catholic Church at one point was at a crossroads between a more Roman view of Catholicism and Christianity, or a more Celtic, more uh, Celtic view of Christianity. We went Rome, unfortunately, because Celtic had a more holistic, I think, kind of spirituality that I think also might have embraced some of the things that you're talking about. But we went with structure and hierarchy, um, unfortunately. So that's a
We
that's.
have about, we have about 2 or 3 minutes, Jim. Anybody else have a comment or question? Will, here in the room. Go ahead, Will.
All right, I don't know what to say, so.
We're gonna call on you on July the 2nd, so you be prepared.
Yeah.
We're talking in Navajo language. Will be with us to speak.
Yeah, so all I wanna say is that indigenous people were strong and resilient, so.
Mhm.
Yes.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I think that is, I was at our Juneteenth celebration here yesterday, and just seeing thousands of people in our Black community vibrant. And I think we have to, seek out those circles, and know that there's a whole history of resistance that goes along with all of the suppression. Um, my partner is of the Pueblo del Sur people, and they have a history of fighting it back against the Spanish. There's this that's a part of the history that's trying to be erased right now, as well. Because if you learn about the oppression, then you're going to also learn about the resistance. And I think we need, as a white male, I need to learn about that as well, because otherwise we can I can fall into a very paternalistic view of other people, of other cultures, of other backgrounds. And that is just a continuation of privilege.
Any concluding thoughts, Joe? You get the last comment.
Bob could use some help converting this room to meet the ministers, so if you could stay around after this, that would be great.
Jim, we thank you for your coming all the way from Milwaukee. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet you in person. Next time you come to town, let us know, please.
I'll be here sometime this year, and I apologize. Sometimes speaking not enough about something can almost be as dangerous as not speaking about it in the right way. So, I encourage you to do your own homework, do your own reading, see what relationships you're in, which relationships you aren't in, and do the daily work, that all of us have to do. But thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Online, we'll see you all next week, same time, same place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks
Thank
so much.
you.
Thank you so much.
Jim, there were about 15 people in the room in case you wanted to know.
I think we'll get some motion, we'll put it here. Okay.
I saw John looking in and said.
Well, I mean.